In a cozy suburb of Tennessee, where one and two-story houses lined the picturesque green streets, there lived three people whom all the neighbors called the beautiful family. The atmosphere there was always friendly and safe. Everyone knew their neighbors by name and tried to say hello to them, at least briefly. In summer, the yards were decorated with lush flower beds, and in winter, neighbors helped each other clear snowdrifts from their yards. This was the kind of community this family lived in. Zamora, 38 years old. She owns a small hairdressing salon, which she set up from scratch on her own. She worked from dawn until late at night and kept dreaming that one day her salon would become the best in the town. Jabari, 40 years old. Zamora's husband, an experienced police officer who has always said that service is first and foremost a vocation, not just a profession. Zaya, 14 years old. A daughter who has had mental disorders since birth and whose development corresponded to a 10-year-old child. She sincerely smiled at passers-by and unconditionally believed that the world around her was good. It seemed that harmony and warmth reigned in this family. At first glance, Zamora and Jabari seemed to balance each other perfectly. She was lively and sociable, he was reserved and calculating, and their daughter Zaya, who needed constant care, was the center of all attention. At first, no one even imagined that there could be anything suspicious. They had just settled in the neighborhood and radiated sincere joy. In the evenings, the family gathered in the kitchen. While Zaya was enthusiastically watching cartoons or drawing, her parents calmly discussed their day. On weekends, they often went to the park together, where the girl fed the ducks in a small pond. The neighbors often saw the father chasing a ball with his daughter in the yard, while the mother watched from the porch, smiling gently. Over time, everything began to change. Zamora's hairdressing salon got more customers, so she stayed late into the evening more and more often. Jabari, on the other hand, often went out at night to answer calls or was on duty. The circumstances were such that both of them were away from home for long periods of time, and Zaya, with her special needs, was either under the supervision of a nanny or left alone. Months passed, and Jabari would return tired or even irritated every time. Zamora noticed that he was not very willing to spend time with her, but was increasingly focused on communicating with his daughter. At first, she was glad that her husband was trying to compensate for Zaya's lack of attention, but later she realized that his care was beginning to take on a strange tone. One evening, around 9 o'clock, Zamora returned from the hairdresser's. Remembering that Zaya was usually in bed by this time, she tiptoed into the nursery to wish her daughter a good night's sleep. But instead of seeing a peacefully sleeping girl, she found Jabari in the room. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, talking in a soft voice, holding Zaya's hands. When Zamora crossed the threshold, he suddenly pulled away and hurriedly let go of the girl's hands. "I was just reading her a story," the man said, as if to justify himself. "You were out late, and my daughter needed attention." Zaya, meanwhile, looked confused and avoided making eye contact with her mother. Zamora decided that she hadn't seen anything too suspicious, so she went to prepare a late dinner, although she still had an unpleasant feeling. Later, she began to notice some details. When the three of them were watching a movie in the living room, Jabari would often sit down close to Zaya, put his arm around her or hold her hands on his knee, even if she was visibly embarrassed and tried to pull away. But as soon as Zamora approached, the man pretended that everything was happening within the framework of family care. Once Zamora noticed how Zaya tensed up when her father touched her. Later, the girl whispered that her father kisses her on the forehead before going to bed, but holds his lips for so long that she gets scared. Hearing this, the mother felt her heart clench with anxiety. One weekend, when Zamora was about to take Zaya to the mall to buy new clothes, the girl suddenly asked, "Can Daddy come with us?" The mother noticed that Jabari was on duty and heard Zaya reply, "That's too bad. He told me that he and I have a secret, and I can't tell you." These words took Zamora by surprise. She tried to find out what it was about, but the girl just looked down and remained silent. The reminder of the secret was increasingly disturbing to Zamora. She began to be suspicious of her husband, but at the same time believed that she might be exaggerating. What if he's just being careful, and I'm looking for a threat that doesn't exist? Nevertheless, her inner turmoil was making itself felt. As the days passed, there was only more work in the salon, The number of visitors was growing, so Zamora agreed to take on additional shifts. Jabari also disappeared from work more and more often. The couple hardly ever saw each other and avoided frank conversations. And yet, in her short conversations with her daughter, her mother began to notice little things that added up to a disturbing mosaic. Zaya shared that in the evenings, her father offered to relax her by massaging her legs or shoulders. At first, it seemed pleasant to the girl, but later she felt uncomfortable. Due to her developmental characteristics, Zaya could not clearly distinguish between acceptable and inappropriate behavior. She just kept repeating, "I don't want him to touch me, but he says, it's good for you." "Mom, is this normal?" A mother's instincts no longer allowed Zamora to pretend that nothing was happening. She tried several times to hint to Jabari that his massages should be limited, but each time she did so, he would explode. "Are you jealous of my own child? Are you in your right mind?" Later, Zamora began waking up at midnight and tiptoeing to her daughter's room. From the twilight corridor, she could see Jabari kneeling by Zai's bed, stroking her arms or thighs and whispering something in a low voice. The girl did not push him away, although her eyes showed fear and complete confusion. Once seeing this scene, the mother wanted to run in and pull the man away, but he suddenly turned around and looked at her with an icy challenge, saying, "Stay out of this." Zamora shuddered, and the frightened Zaya only whispered, "Mom." However, the woman was so afraid of the angry policeman that she felt her legs giving out and stepped away. The events escalated like an avalanche. During the day, there were intense clashes, and at night there was oppressive silence. Zaya was so frightened that Zamora was afraid to leave her and her father alone. The woman felt the inevitability of disaster, but had no idea where to turn. Who would believe that something so terrible could happen in this model family? And he is a policeman. The very thought made her even more terrified. Late at night, almost before midnight, Zamora returned home. The only light on the entire floor was in Zay's room, and that made her heart pound even harder. She carefully entered the house, taking off her shoes to avoid making noise, and then silently went upstairs to the second floor and fell against the door of the nursery. The picture that opened before her was more terrifying than all her darkest guesses. Zaya was sitting on the bed in her short pajamas, her knees trembling visibly. Jabari, also in his pajamas, knelt by the girl's feet, massaging them and whispering softly, "This is our little ritual. Don't tell anyone. Calm down." It was clear that Zaya was scared to the core. When she met her mother's eyes, she exhaled almost silently, "Mom." Her father, meanwhile, looked back at Zamora with a blank, distant gaze, as if convinced that she would not dare to intervene. An uncontrollable wave of indignation broke out in the woman's chest. She realized that she could not take it anymore. Rushing into the hallway, where the key to the drawer with her husband's gun was on a small cabinet, she instantly snatched it, broke the lock with her trembling hands, and took out the weapon. Hearing the commotion, Jabari rushed in after her, but Zamora stepped back, holding the gun at chest level. "Don't move, I saw everything. Now stay away from our child." Her voice was shaking with fear, but it was loud and unequivocal. Her father snorted, "What makes you think anyone will believe you? I'm a policeman and you? I'll tell them you're crazy. Drop that gun before you get yourself into trouble." His eyes were cold and contemptuous. He took a step forward, and Zaya peeked out from behind the door, sobbing and looking at her mother in fear. At that moment, Zamora felt it with her whole being. "I have to protect my daughter, at any cost." When Zamora's finger unwittingly pulled the trigger, she didn't realize what she was doing. The first shot rang out, cutting through the silence of the night like a sudden thunderbolt. The bullet struck Jabari in the chest, and his groan echoed in the hallway. However, Zamora's instinct had already taken over. She fired 2 more shots in a row, and 3 flashes shattered the silence, seemingly stopping the breath of the entire house. For a moment, the corridor was lit by the heat of the gun's muzzle. Shadows flashed across the walls, and Zaya, who had looked out of the room, screamed, clutching her hands to her ears. Jabari staggered, dropped what he was clinging to, and fell down powerlessly. Zamora stood there, breathing heavily as if her heart was literally tearing out of her chest. Only one thought was running through her mind. I saved Zay. If not for that, he would have done something terrible to her. But then came a fierce shock. I just killed my own husband. Her inner world seemed to split in two, filled with a sense of despair, disgust, hatred, and at the same time, protective love for her daughter. After the crack of 3 shots, there was a few seconds of silence. Zamora was still standing with the gun in her hand, her heartbeat pounding in her head. The only thing she could hear was Zaya's sobs as she shivered by the door. Jabari lay on the floor with a sharp pain in his chest, unable to get up. Dark stains of blood had already appeared through the fabric of his pajamas, slowly dripping onto the floor. Zamora finally smelled the sour smell of gunpowder in the air, merging with the iron scent of blood. Her lungs began to tighten. Panic rose in her chest and her thoughts scattered like wild animals. I shot him. 3 shots. Have I lost my mind? But there was no other way. He would not stop. Suddenly, Zamora heard her daughter's small voice in her head. Zaya approached her mother with unsteady steps, covering her face with her palms. Feeling a heavy lump in her throat, Zamora threw the gun aside and held the girl tightly to her, trying to comfort her sobs. The gunshots shook the nighttime silence of the suburb. In this peaceful neighborhood, gunfire was rare, so the distraught neighbors immediately called 911. 5 minutes later, 2 patrol cars with their lights on were already parked outside the house. Zamora could hear loud shouts from the yard. Police! Drop your weapons! The woman gently took her daughter's hand and, trembling, headed for the stairs. Jabari's muffled moaning came from the side of the room. Zamora flinched. Is he still alive? But she quickly realized that she could hardly help him. The girl clung to her mother more and more tightly, mumbling something barely audible, as if she had lost the ability to speak from nervous shock. 2 officers with raised pistols had already entered the house. The beams of their flashlights illuminated Zamora, who did not resist and silently raised her hands to show that she was not carrying a weapon. Caught between her mother and the men in uniform, Zaya was lost and did not understand what was happening. Drop the weapon, one of the policemen shouted loudly, seeing the gun on the floor. I already put it down, Zamora whispered, fighting back tears. I shot. I was defending my daughter. One officer slowly raised his gun and checked it, while the other spoke into his radio. Call an ambulance. We have a wounded man. The ambulance arrived unexpectedly quickly. The paramedics immediately went up to the 2nd floor, where they found Jabari practically bleeding to death. The paramedics tried to save him, did everything in their power, but 3 gunshot wounds to the chest and abdominal cavity proved to be incompatible with life. In a few minutes, the doctor pronounced him dead. When the body was covered with a sheet, the room fell into an oppressive silence. The police officers, who knew Jabari as a fellow officer, looked at each other in confusion. One of them, holding a notebook in his hand, looked at Zamora as if not understanding how it could be that his wife had shot an officer. Zamora, clutching Zay to her chest, kept her eyes on the spot where Jabari was lying. She took a few hesitant steps forward, but the officer immediately stopped her. Excuse me, don't come any closer. You need to come with me. Hearing this, Zaya burst into tears. She did not understand why her mother was not allowed to even get closer, and Zamora herself was almost fainting from everything that was happening around her. She was not beaten or handcuffed, but she was officially detained. Fingerprints were taken and preliminary case files were drawn up. Neighbors who came out of their houses in their nightgowns saw the police take Zamora away, and a stunned Zaya stood next to another officer. People were whispering, "What happened? Did she really kill her own husband? Why?" Sitting in the patrol car, Zamora begged, "Don't leave my daughter, she is special. Please give her to my family or at least to a friend." Everything was developing too fast and social services had to immediately determine where to temporarily place Zay. The girl, not understanding anything, watched her mother being taken away and screamed in despair, "Mom, I'm scared, don't leave me." Zamora could hardly keep from crying. She felt both burning guilt and the certainty that she had to do it. Her thoughts revolved around one thing. I had to. He really did something terrible to her. Later, the woman was placed in a temporary detention center. In a small room surrounded by bars, she sat wrapped in a thin blanket. The images flashed in her mind again and again. The 3 shots that came from her hands. Zay's frightened look. Jabari's last look. With each passing minute, her panic only grew. What if I made a mistake? What if it was just a massage? But she was afraid, and he intimidated me, repeating that no one would believe. This stream of doubts kept her awake until the morning. Meanwhile, Zaya remained under the supervision of social services. A temporary guardian was appointed for the girl, but she hardly ever made contact with adults. Among the fragments of her words, we heard the phrases, "Dad touched my legs," "Mom shot," "I'm scared." People around her noticed that the girl was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. She was referred to a child psychologist. In the specialist's notebook, there were mentions of her father staying up late when she was sleepy, stroking her and whispering, "You won't tell anyone. You're my smart girl." Zaya could not clearly explain how horrible this was, but she felt terribly afraid. The Tennessee State Police had no right to ignore the case because the deceased was a colleague. At the same time, law enforcement officers had to remain objective while looking into all the complex details of the tragedy. When the forensic experts arrived at the scene, they found 3 bullet casings and stated that the death was caused by gunshot wounds to the chest. In Zay's room, experts seized several items, pajamas, blankets, and tissue remnants with traces of blood, to check for biological fluids. The version of possible sexual violence was not ruled out, but the investigation did not yet have enough confirmed facts. In this regard, criminal proceedings were opened against Zamora under the article on murder. She did not deny it. "Yes, I shot, but I did it to protect my daughter because she could not defend herself." The news that the wife had killed the policeman with his own weapon spread like wildfire through local periodicals and even reached regional TV channels. Some said, "She went crazy, fired bullets for no good reason." Others speculated he was probably really molesting the child, and the mother was defending her. Friends of the family recalled that they had not noticed anything suspicious about Jabari, although they did notice that Zamora had been looking anxious lately. Neighbors confessed, "Who could have imagined that he could turn out to be some kind of beast? But you never know what's going on behind someone's door." Society split into 2 camps. One part sincerely sympathized with the mother, convinced that she had good reasons for taking such a harsh step. The other accused her of jealousy or paranoia and harshly condemned her. While Zaya remained in the care of social services, Zamora spent several days in pretrial detention, awaiting her first court hearing on a preventive measure. During this time, her psyche was on edge. All the time, horrific images kept popping up in her mind. How she pulled the trigger for the first time and felt a sharp jolt. How the second and third shots sounded almost like a single volley. How Jabari's face instantly contorted in pain and horror. A few weeks after the tragedy, the investigation collected primary materials. The police made a preliminary conclusion. Zamora had shot Jabari 3 times with her service pistol, killing him. The motive, according to the official version, was to protect her daughter from possible abuse. However, an open question remained. Was this abuse actually proven? The situation was complicated by the fact that Zaya, due to her developmental characteristics, could not give unambiguous testimony. She told us how scared she was, how she didn't want her father to touch her, but she couldn't clearly explain whether any sexual acts had taken place. The psychologist who spoke to her noted that the girl was indeed afraid of her father's nightly visits, pointing to his strange look and long strokes of her legs. Meanwhile, the investigators tried to question Zamora in more detail. She told them about the disturbing massages late at night, about his strange warnings not to tell anyone, about direct threats, "No one will believe you," which he voiced just before she pulled the trigger. She recorded each point in detail in her testimony, fully realizing that all this would form the basis of the trial. On the other hand, the neighbors recalled that they did not observe anything suspicious inside the house, but they did hear quarrels in the family recently. Someone noticed Jabari yelling at Zamora in the street. The family, they said, did not have many friends, so no one saw the full picture. However, the information gathered was enough for the prosecutor's office to charge Zamora with murder. But despite all this, she kept asking herself, maybe I exaggerated too much, and he had no criminal intentions at all? However, it was worth remembering how Zaya hysterically shouted, "I'm scared," as her heart clenched with pain and doubt. When Zamora, who was arrested immediately after the tragedy, was brought to the preliminary hearing, she appeared before the court with her shoulders slumped and her eyes extinguished. She was wearing a simple dark dress, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, an image that did not resemble the former cheerful and confident hairdresser. The judge read out the key points of the indictment, and the prosecutor emphasized that it was a case of intentional deprivation of life with the use of a firearm. In contrast, Zamora's lawyer, who was invited on the recommendation of friends, said that she had acted in a state of passion because she was defending her child. There were few people in the courtroom, a few journalists following the case, and a few neighbors who came either out of curiosity or a desire to support her. In the corner, Zaya sat under the supervision of a social worker, clutching a teddy bear to her chest and looking down at her feet. The case was being heard in a Tennessee district court, and the public outcry was quite noticeable. Some people sympathized with the mother, while others were outraged that she had committed an outlawed killing. The prosecution's position: Zamora could have called the police if she suspected harassment. There was no direct evidence that Jabari had actually committed a crime. Instead of acting through official mechanisms or engaging psychologists, she resorted to lynching. In addition, the deceased was a police officer with an excellent reputation, so the prosecution demanded a harsh sentence. Zamora's lawyer insisted that it was an effect caused by a sudden realization of the danger to a defenseless child with mental disabilities. The mother came into the room and saw Jabari's strange actions and heard him say, "No one will believe you." Knowing that her husband was a respected police officer, she was terrified that he would use his position, and that is why she acted immediately. Among the evidence presented by the defense were the conclusions of a psychologist. He emphasized that Zaya was clearly afraid of her father, as every time he mentioned Jabari, she started crying and repeated, "I don't want to see him." Despite the fact that the girl could not clearly describe the illegal implications of her father's actions, her emotional reaction showed strong discomfort and a sense of threat. One of the most difficult moments of the process was the interview with Zaya herself. The girl, accompanied by a social worker, timidly entered the room, holding a teddy bear tightly. The judge tried to ask her in a gentle tone whether she understood that she had to tell the truth. Zaya nodded and said in a trembling voice that, "My dad liked to massage my feet when I was sleeping and said it was our secret." When the prosecutor asked her to explain whether this scared her, the girl nodded again and then confessed in a whisper, "I asked him to stop, and he said it was good for me." At this point, it became difficult for her to hold back her tears, so the judge was forced to call a break. Later, at the next hearing, a psychologist who had worked with the child took the stand. He confirmed that Zay had severe anxiety related to her father. She talked about unwanted touching, but due to her intellectual level, she could not clearly define the nature of these actions. According to the psychologist, everything indicated that the child was experiencing fear and emotional discomfort. During the trial, the police provided photographic evidence from the scene. The pictures showed 3 shell casings scattered on the floor. A forensic expert confirmed that all the bullets had hit the chest area, meaning that Zamora had fired purposefully at close range. The photos proved that it was not an accidental fire in the air or a warning shot. The target was chosen in a vital area. There was obvious support for the prosecution from Jabari's colleagues. They argued that the deceased was considered a true professional, always remembered his family with warmth, and never showed aggression. One of the officers who knew him well emphasized, "He adored his daughter. I never heard him say a single ambiguous or strange word." Zamora's allegations seem absolutely incredible to me. Meanwhile, Zamora herself sat with an impenetrable expression on her face, although rage was boiling inside her. She kept repeating in her head, "No one has any idea what was really going on in our house when the door was closed." After several weeks of court hearings, numerous testimonies and heated discussions between the defense and the prosecution, the jury carefully weighed all the facts. Based on their verdict, the judge had to make a final decision. The jury found Zamora guilty of murder, but at the same time emphasized that she acted in a state of deep emotional distress and truly believed she was saving the child. When Zamora appeared for the verdict, she wore a modest dark dress and looked down at the floor. The jury's secretary read out their decision. "We have come to the conclusion that the defendant is guilty of murder, but we recommend that a number of mitigating circumstances be taken into account." The judge nodded slowly and announced the verdict. Zamora, the court finds you guilty of the murder of Jabari. However, taking into account your state of mind, the absence of previous violence, and the special needs of your child, who relies on you, I am sentencing you to probation. You are obliged to comply with the terms of the probationary period, to report regularly, and to visit a psychologist. In case of violation of any of these requirements, the suspended sentence will be changed to real imprisonment. Concerned whispers were immediately heard in the room. Some of the audience breathed a sigh of relief, while others were outraged. Journalists reacted to this verdict as an unprecedented decision. Hearing the judge's words, Zamora covered her mouth with her palm and burst into tears, both from relief that she would escape the prison walls and from the painful realization that she was now officially recognized as a murderer. The moments of the fatal shots flashed before her eyes, and she realized that she would have to live with this burden. During the announcement of the sentence, Zaya was next to her mother, but under the supervision of a social worker. The girl did not quite understand what was happening, but when she noticed how upset her mother was, she began to cry. Her sincere tears did not leave many people in the courtroom indifferent. After the suspended sentence was pronounced, Zamora was released from custody. She left the court holding her daughter's hand. They had a difficult period ahead of them. They had to return to a house full of terrible memories and try to find a new beginning. Zamora was afraid to cross the threshold of the house where those tragic events took place. The walls that had once been her protection now reminded her of the last moments of Jabari's life. The open door of the nursery caught her eye, and Zamora's heart went cold. Zaya, sensing her mother's anxiety, squeezed her hand tightly and spoke softly. "Mom, can I sleep with you tonight? I'm scared." With a sigh, the woman looked at her daughter tenderly. Despite the pain, she tried to be strong. "Of course, dear," the mother whispered. "It's not so scary together." According to the judge's decision, Zamora is obliged to comply with several important conditions. Regularly check in with a curator who monitors the fulfillment of the terms of her probation. Visit a psychologist to work on her emotional state and monitor possible manifestations of aggression. Avoid any interference in investigations related to Jabari's activities. If there are any inquiries from the police, Zamora should answer frankly, but without independently searching for or contacting her husband's former colleagues. If Zamora ever violated the conditions imposed on her or left the city without court approval, she could be sent to prison. Meanwhile, the small town was abuzz with talk of the verdict. The news spread like lightning. Some were happy that justice had taken into account the real circumstances and saved Zamora from an overly harsh punishment. Others were outraged, saying, "She killed a police officer and got off with a suspended sentence." Some of Zamora's old friends openly expressed their sympathy for her, saying, "You acted like a mother, saving your own child. Even if it cost such a terrible step, we understand you." Some of her neighbors, on the other hand, began to avoid her and look at her suspiciously, discussing rumors of possible jealousy or exaggeration. In the end, no one but Zamora and Zay could know all the details of what happened. The relatives of the deceased perceived the verdict as a betrayal. They accused Zamora of premeditated murder, repeating, "Our son would never do harm to his own daughter." They tried to appeal the court's decision, wrote complaints to lawyers, but this could not change the outcome of the trial. Moreover, they tried to slander Zamora on social media, but these attacks did not receive wide publicity outside the town. When Zamora returned to her salon, she faced new challenges. Although many clients were sympathetic, knowing the story from both sides, some refused to use the services of the killer at all, no matter what her motives were. As a result, profits plummeted, and Zamora was barely able to keep one assistant to keep the business running. Rare visits to the salon by journalists seeking an exclusive about the hairdresser who shot her husband, a police officer, were always turned down. Zamora did not want to disclose any details of her life, as even brief memories caused her internal tension. Despite the enormous moral and financial burdens, she knew she had to keep working because she had a daughter to support. Loans taken out to expand the salon before the tragic events turned into a heavy debt noose. According to the court order, Zamora underwent regular psychotherapy sessions. At first, she attended them reluctantly, not believing that anyone could reduce the pain of her experience. However, over time, The therapist helped her to realize her own attitudes from her childhood when she felt a lack of support, which is probably why she was desperate to protect Zay. He also taught her to separate the feeling of guilt from the urgent need in those circumstances. Zamora recalled over and over again that in her mind she had no other choice but to immediately stop those pernicious actions. In addition, she gradually learned ways to overcome the painful memories of the 3 shots and the bloody spots on the floor, and was prescribed mild sedatives and breathing exercises. Zaya also needed the care of a specialist. The psychologist, who specialized in working with children with special needs, listened carefully to her stories about her father's nightly visits and his touching her legs and shoulders. She was stunned to admit that she could not understand how to say no, and only repeated that she was scared and uncomfortable. The investigation never found direct evidence of sexual violence, but the girl's reactions showed that Zamora's fears were not unfounded. Time passed and gradually life began to move on. Zaya went back to school, where her schedule was changed and an additional teacher was hired to support her. At first, her classmates only whispered about the loud scandal, but over time she managed to make friends with those who understood her. Zamora also gradually stopped hiding from others. At first, she would shop late at night to avoid meeting anyone, but later she realized that she had to learn to keep her head up and move on with her life. Over time, some of her neighbors who had previously judged her changed their attitude. They saw how scared Zaya remained and how honestly Zamora fulfilled all the requirements of the court. They gossiped about her less often, and some even began to sympathize with her, realizing that she could not regain her former reputation. But no matter what, Jabari was still a part of their history. Sometimes Zamora would come across his things in the house, his uniform, his documents. Some of them she simply burned because just looking at them made her heart shrink with pain and fear. But she kept one photo of Jabari holding little Zaya with a smile, thinking that her daughter should someday realize that her father was not always a monster, even though those memories are now colored in black. Zaya would sometimes ask, "Mom, why did he do that? Didn't he love me?" This was the most painful question to which Zamora could not find a clear answer. She tried to explain what happens when people do evil things despite their love, but at the same time, deep down, she doubted whether it could be called true love. The suspended sentence, which lasted for several years, was accompanied by a period of probation, so Zamora carefully followed all the requirements. Inside her, she simultaneously felt the pain of loss, shame and fear, and the certainty that she had done what she had done to save her daughter. Every morning she went to work in her own hairdressing salon, slowly building up her clientele. Every evening she would hug Zaya, who sometimes fell asleep in her mother's room or crawled under her blanket if she was frightened by nightmares. Zamora still hoped that eventually she would meet people who would not look at her with judgment. For now, her main goal remained the care and upbringing of her daughter. Zaya's psyche was gradually stabilizing, even though she remained traumatized. The girl began to be less afraid, gradually realizing that her father was gone and that there was some terrible reason behind it. Although some people in the city still whisper "murderer" behind her back, Zamora has learned to live with it. After all, she has already withstood a much more serious blow of fate. This story serves as a cautionary tale for the Tennessee suburb, reminding us that not every family that seems perfect is in fact so. People still recall that ominous night when 3 shots were fired and a woman in a state of rage took the life of her husband, believing she was saving her child. The society is left with difficult questions to which it is difficult to find an unambiguous answer. Could the tragedy have been stopped if the suspicions had been spoken out loud? Was it justified to use such harsh methods? But the court has already passed a verdict, and Zamora and Zaya have to continue their journey. Their family now consists of a mother who carries a gnawing guilt for her actions in her heart, and a daughter who may not have realized the full extent of the events that took place, but felt that her mother had saved her, in fact paying for it with her father's life. The lesson they both learned was a sad reminder of how dangerous it can be to keep problems quiet and how poorly official means of protection sometimes work when it comes to fear for a special child and the instinct for self-preservation.